Hello, class. This week we're going to jump into chapter 11, and this chapter is going to be really about a bunch of different types of exercise testing. The lab is going to focus on VO2 max testing again, but a different type. But then before we get to that, I'm going to introduce a couple other types of tests, and I have some videos for you just so you can see what they're like, but I'm not going to have you record any data on those specific things. So I think the first thing I want to just talk about is this principle of specificity. Now this goes back to exercise in general. That if you want to improve a certain characteristic of your fitness, you have to train in a way that stresses the appropriate systems, right? So if you want to improve your VO2 max, you have to train using aerobic exercise, right? But if you want to improve your broad jump, you want to be able to jump farther, aerobic exercise is not going to help you jump farther. You have to train using methods that will help you jump farther. So the best way to do that is to jump, right? That's kind of obvious. But strength training, other explosive types of activities like sprinting can also help you jump farther. So the principle of specificity states that your body is going to adapt in specific ways to specific types of stimuli, okay? And this PowerPoint kind of focuses on the energy systems that we've already talked about. Remember, the immediate, glycolysis, and the aerobic energy system. And that if you want to improve any one of those three systems, you have to train in a way that will improve those systems because of that principle of specificity. And you also need to test in specific ways, right? If you're going to help somebody improve any fitness characteristic, ideally you would test them beforehand to kind of see where they stand initially. Then you would carry out some training with that person, and then you would test them again to see if they've improved, right? So going back to my example of the broad jump, if you have an athlete, and the broad jump is a great test for sort of explosive abilities. So let's just say you have a sprinter who does the 50-yard dash. Of course you can test using the 50-yard dash, and you should, but the broad jump might be another way to gauge their explosiveness, right? So I would do a broad jump test with somebody on their first day in my gym, and then we might train for 6 weeks, and then I would retest them on the broad jump to see if they've improved, okay? And we would do the same thing with VO2 max, which is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. Explosive characteristics and aerobic characteristics are on opposite ends of the spectrum. So if I have an athlete who wants to improve their VO2 max, we would do a VO2 max test on day one, and then we would train to improve their VO2 max doing a lot of aerobic-based activities, even some interval training, and then we would test their VO2 max again 6 weeks later and measure how much they've improved. If they've improved a lot, then we know what we have been doing works. If they do not improve, or heaven forbid they get worse, then we know our training program stinks and we need to do something different. So that's the value of testing, okay? So just remember, I think one of the questions I'm going to ask you all is, define the principle of specificity. And I would again say that that can be defined by saying that specific body systems are going to adapt in specific ways to specific stimuli. I know I just said the word specific 3 times in one sentence, but that kind of hits my point home very hard. And if you want to adapt and improve in certain fitness categories, you have to train in very specific ways. And this kind of shows exactly what I was talking about, right? Is that just because you have a high VO2 max with a specific sport, say with running, does not necessarily mean you're going to get a high VO2 max test in a swimming test or a rowing test. Again, that specificity concept, the concept of specificity, states that the adaptations that we see in response to exercise are very specific, right? So I can't be a runner and do nothing but run and then expect to be a good swimmer, right? Because swimming is different from running, and there are specific adaptations that occur in response to running, which are not going to occur in response to swimming, okay? And those are two aerobic activities. But again, that principle of specificity dictates the adaptations to certain activities are very specific to that individual activity, okay? And this slide is in this graph are, again, speaking to the energy systems, right? So again, imagine that you're an athlete or just a general fitness individual and you want to improve or train for a specific event. One thing to consider would be which energy system does that event or that activity primarily use, right? So again, if we have somebody who wants to train for a half marathon, which is a 13.1 mile race, clearly that's going to take longer than 10 minutes, right? So this graph shows us that anything beyond 10 minutes is almost exclusively using your aerobic or your long-term energy system. So this is going to be the primary energy system you would want to train to get good at that activity. Now on the other end of the spectrum, let's go back to our broad jump example. If I have somebody that I want to train to be able to do a better broad jump, and who might want to do that? Well, let's say you have a football player, college football player, who is planning to go to the NFL Combine. One of the tests that they will do at the NFL Combine is the broad jump. So it would be good for you to be able to train that athlete to become better at the broad jump, because then he would test better at the NFL Combine. Okay, so a broad jump takes how long? 2 seconds, maybe not even that long. Okay, so if we look at our energy systems, we can see that in that duration less than 10 seconds, the immediate energy system, and we also call that the ATP PCR system, right, is the system that is going to be used for the broad jump. So I'm going to want to train that athlete almost exclusively with activities that rely on that energy system. So we're talking about explosive activities such as jumping of any type, short sprints, Olympic lifts such as like the hang clean, the snatch, etc., or even maximal intensity squats, bench presses, things like that. Very low rep weight training that is very high intensity, because again, that's going to keep us in that less than 10-second range. Okay. And then just to put a bow on this, let's say you have somebody who they run the 400 and they want to get better at it. So they're trying to take their time from 60 to 45 seconds, say. Remember, a 400 meter is one time around a track that would surround a football field. So because their sport puts them right in that 45-second time range, we're going to look here and note that the anaerobic, or the short-term energy system, I don't love that they use different terms here, but this is referring to glycolysis. That's going to be the primary system stressed during the 400. So we would want to train that person using activities that are going to primarily stress the glycolytic energy system, right? So higher repetition, weight training stuff, obviously running at a high rate of speed where they can only sustain that speed for less than 2 minutes should be the primary focus of our training. And again, all of this kind of speaks to that principle of specificity. Okay, whatever your athlete wants to improve at, you need to look at what types of training stimulus you need to apply that's going to stress the systems that they would use in their sport. All right, so let's jump to our broad jumper, this person whose sport is very explosive. We're going to need to evaluate the immediate energy system, because we want to see, before we start training that person, where do they stand, right? So we're going to pick a test that is going to adequately show the ability of their immediate energy system to supply ATP very rapidly, okay? So here are a few assumptions that we would make when picking these tests, okay? Again, we want to make sure all the ATP used for this activity is provided from phosphocreatine. Therefore, the test that we pick needs to be less than 10 seconds long. That's a key point. In fact, they even recommend that keeping the test to less than 6 seconds would be ideal. Now, that's not a problem, because any jumping-based test is only going to take like 1 second, right? You jump, you land, that's the end of the test. That only takes 1 second. most of us can't levitate for beyond 6 seconds in the air. Some, maybe pro basketball players can, but most of us humans cannot do that. So what are some common, before we get to the test, what are we actually sort of able to determine from a test like this? Well, if somebody scores really poorly on one of these tests, then we know that, you know, their immediate energy system is not highly functional. We might then ask ourselves, why would that be? Well, a couple reasons are given here. Maybe they don't have a high amount of phosphocreatine stored in their cells, okay? We could change that by training them to store more, which we would do by having them do these high explosive activities over and over again. And then also they could supplement. Now, one of the few supplements that's been proven scientifically to be very beneficial with no negative effects is creatine supplementation. One of the ways it works is it increases the amount of PCR found in your muscles, therefore increasing the capacity of that energy system, okay? Another factor that could cause them to score poorly on the test is they're fatigued, and therefore their PCR is depleted from some prior activity. So it's very important when you're doing tests to evaluate the immediate energy system that you make sure the athlete is fresh and not fatigued, because that test will really be negatively impacted if somebody is tired before they do it, right? So if you're doing a whole bunch of tests in one day, it's recommended that you do these tests first before they accumulate fatigue after an hour worth of testing, right? If you have somebody doing various tests for an hour and you do this type of test at the end, there's going to be a negative consequence, right? So you always want to do these tests first, early in the session, before residual fatigue begins to accumulate. So what we're really evaluating with immediate energy system tests are muscular power, okay? Power is defined as work accomplished or force development divided by time, okay? Somebody who's powerful can produce a lot of force in a short amount of time, okay? Somebody who's not powerful will take a longer amount of time to generate that same amount of force, okay? So if you think about it, when somebody jumps, a vertical jump, they're generating a ton of force very rapidly, okay? So that's what we're evaluating with these types of tests, is power. So I have here a couple examples of different power tests. There is one that is commonly used with firefighters, and it's basically evaluating the time that it takes you to sprint up a flight of stairs, okay? You can see where, again, the principle of specificity states with firefighters, that's a very important skill. So that's a good test to use with that population. The much more common test is just a simple vertical jump, which I have a quick video clip here that we'll watch here in a second. But really, as I mentioned earlier, any type of all-out test that takes less than 6 to 8 seconds is going to be a good way to evaluate muscular power. All right, now let me see if I can open this video clip and have the screencast continue to work. I'm gonna probably want to.
All right, hello again. So we're going to run through the anaerobic power.
Let's mute that guy. All right, so what I'm going to show you here is evaluating anaerobic power using a device called a Vertec. The Vertec is here, and I think I'll zoom out on it here in just a moment. But the Vertec is a very simple device that has essentially like a measurement stick. Here, you can see these numbers. And then we have these veins. And what we'll have our athlete do is jump to see the highest vein that they can touch. And this is a really accurate way to measure somebody's vertical jump. So I'm setting the base height right now. And it looks like it's set at 84 inches. I'm going to raise it to 90. And I'm actually dropping it back down just to kind of show you. You want to set this based on the height of your athlete. The athlete I'm about to test is a shorter individual. So I'm setting the base height here at 7. And what that's referring to now, the base height number that we just saw is the height of this first vein, okay? And then every red vein from there on up is 6, every blue is 1, every white is a ½ inch, right? So I can quickly count how high somebody jumps using this Vertec device. Let me scroll ahead just slightly. And here's a zoomed out picture of it. So what we're going to do here with Lindsay is I'm going to first measure her reach height. So she's going to hold her arm up and walk through. And let's just say her reach height is, 84 inches. I'm going to note that, write that down. I'm counting how high the reach height is. Okay. After we establish her reach height, we're then going to probably raise the base up because I know she might be able to jump over the top of this. And then we're going to have her do a maximal jump. Now notice when you do a vertical jump test, there's no step. You have your feet planted and you do sort of a counter movement, spring up as high as you possibly can. And I believe Lindsay will do that here momentarily. You always teach the person what to do. And we always allow three attempts on this, and we score the best of the 3 attempts. Usually people do a little bit better on the second attempt. Now, she might be able to jump to the top of this. So this is where I'm going to raise the base. Because if she jumps and touches over the top, that's a wasted attempt. So I'm going to raise the base a little bit. I can keep these moved out of the way because I could assume that she would at least touch this high, okay? So once we get the base height readjusted, we're going to then do some vertical jump attempts. I'm just indicating there, you don't need to swat at the thing. It's very tempting for people to take a big volleyball spike swing, but you're wasting energy when you do that. You want to have all your momentum going upwards and just tap it, versus if you have a lot of forward momentum, that takes away from the energy that you contribute towards going vertically. So once Lindsay's ready, we'll allow her to kind of go on her own. She's going to do a counter movement and jump, touch with one hand. So she knocked several out of the way. So what I would do is move those out of the way. I would go ahead and quickly tabulate what her jump height is. And then I'll let her do it again and see if she can get a little bit higher. This works well because now they have a goal to shoot for. Okay, I can get 2 more, right? So we'll let her go again. See if she gets 1 more. One more attempt. Well, we'll give her 2 more. I'm just going to show you all one more go. Oh, she got a little bit higher, so she knocked over 2 more. Okay. So what we'll do then is we'll take the number here and we'll subtract her jump height. Sorry, we'll subtract her reach height from her jump height. So let's say that her reach height was 80. Her jump height was 125. That means her vertical jump was 25 inches. Okay. And that's her 3rd attempt. So look, she got a little bit higher, right? So I would score the best attempt, which on this example was her last attempt, okay? So that's just an example of a test that we could use to evaluate muscular power or the ability of the immediate energy system to function, right? So I would then train Lindsay for 4 to 6 weeks doing a lot of explosive activities, and what I would hope to see is that her vertical jump would increase at least 1 inch, maybe more, depending upon how well trained she was beforehand. Okay. So now let's move to a little bit longer type of activity, which would use the glycolytic energy system. And again, sorry that they changed the terminology in the PowerPoints, but they're saying short term, and what they're referring to is glycolysis or the anaerobic energy system. So this needs to be something that's longer in duration, right? They give us a time limit here of up to 3 minutes, which makes sense. Remember that if we go back to this graph real quick, we're looking at something that kind of maxes out around 2 minutes, right? So if we're an athlete whose sport puts us in this time duration, such as a 400 or an 800 meter sprinter would, or different swimming events, There's not a lot of team sports that would utilize this as much. We want to make sure our test takes about this long as well. Now, these tend to be the most painful test, right? And you could probably imagine if you're running as hard as you can for 2 minutes, that's going to hurt a lot, okay? So there's some factors that will influence the result of tests, which we'll talk about in a second. Before we get to that, though, there are a few examples. You know, running all out for a certain period of time. There's a stationary bike test, which we're going to look at here momentarily. That's the most commonly used test. It's called the Wingate test. But there are other types of tests that you could use to evaluate the fitness of this system, such as, you know, performing a large number of reps of a strength exercise as well. Again, whatever the athlete is doing, you want to pick a test that is very closely related to the activity that they do, okay? Now, because this test can be very difficult, motivation is a big factor, right? As we'll see in a moment when we look at the sample video, you have to be very motivated to do well in these tests. And the one that we're going to look at, the Wingate, is a 30-second all-out cycling test, which doesn't sound hard, but it is. As you'll see in the video, it gets very difficult at the end. So it would be very easy for somebody to quit in that instance, okay, and give up, I should say. So you have to be highly motivated. Usually body size affects the test, where we're gonna like in the Wingate, we're gonna set the bike resistance at a percentage of the person's body weight. So the more somebody weighs, the harder it's gonna be for them, unfortunately. Okay. With age, children tend to not do well in these types of tests because their anaerobic capacity is usually lacking quite a bit. So these types of tests are not really used for children as much as the other two types of tests that we're going to talk about today, okay? Again, though, we should pick an activity that closely mimics the sport. So if we have a track athlete, we want to do a running-based test. If we had a cyclist, we would use the cycling test. If we had somebody who maybe played football or does strength training, we would choose a weightlifting-based test. With research, the cycling test is the most commonly used, and that test is known as the Wingate. Okay, so there are a lot of different lengths that you can do the Wingate for. The most common time duration the Wingate is used for is 30 seconds. And what we do is we set the resistance on the bike as a percentage of the person's body weight. Okay, so we convert their body weight in pounds to kilograms, and then we take 7.5% of their weight in kilograms, and that's the load that we put on the bike, okay? Then what we ask the person to do is start pedaling as fast as they can. We load the bike immediately, and it gets hard right away, but we want them just to keep pedaling as fast as they possibly can for 30 seconds, okay? The numbers that we can get for this, there's kind of a lot of them. We can get the peak power. So usually we get the peak power within the first 5 seconds, because beyond 5 seconds, their speed that they can pedal really starts to go down, okay? But what we can also calculate is then the average power, relative power, which is expressed as a function of their body mass, okay? And then what their rate of fatigue, their fatigue index, those are just terms that we look at to see like the difference in their peak versus their lowest power. People who are very well trained in this avenue, there's not a lot of difference there, right? But people who are not very well trained, they're going to drop off greatly. Okay, so a fatigue index can be an indicator of what their capacity is to sustain an all-out effort, right? Usually when people are untrained, they drop off very rapidly. But if we have a very well-trained individual, their fatigue index is lower because their difference between their peak and their lowest power outputs is not too dramatic, okay? I'm going to have a guest star on the rest of the video, which is my baby Sadie, because she woke up and I got to carry on with the PowerPoint. So let me grab her, then we'll watch the video for the Wingate. All right, so this here is the baby. I'm going to feed her while we check out the rest of this lecture. So let's look at the Wingate. So here's kind of the setup. This is the bike that we use for the wind gate. It's known as the Monarch cycle ergometer. Oops. So what we have done is we have calculated a percentage, 7.5% of Lindsay's body mass. Okay, these guys over here, my other graduate assistants, they're going to help me count how many times the pedal goes around, right? So we calculate the power by knowing the resistance that she's cycling against, and then we calculate the speed by counting how many revolutions this goes. Okay, the distance is known by knowing that this flywheel in the bike is 6 meters. So for every revolution of the pedal, she travels 6 meters, right? So if she pedals 5 times 6, 30 meters. So that's how we calculate the power using this specific test. So these guys here are helping count the pedal revolutions while I do the timer, and I'm going to load the cycle. So let's play it for a second. So I'm going to have Lindsay start pedaling as fast as she can, and then I'm going to put the load on. Right, now notice I'm just going to let it play. Here we go. I'm putting the load on. Now she's going as fast as she can, but notice her speed is steadily declining because she is fatiguing, which again is to be expected because this test is very difficult. Now notice she's going a lot slower now. 30 seconds, we're probably getting close to the end. Now she's moving much more slowly, which again is to be expected. And we stopped. So I'm going to unload it and let her just cool down some. Let's see if we pan out a little bit. So look, Lindsay's very tired. Now she's a beast. She's an athlete. So she's highly motivated and she's accustomed to enduring discomfort, right? So again, this kind of speaks to the idea that motivation is important for this test. What I'm just telling the students here is how many revolutions we counted in each 5-second period. I'm not going to have you all do that. But from this test, we can evaluate what her anaerobic capacity is, how able she is to resist fatigue, etc. And really gives us a good indicator of what her short-term energy system, what the capacity is for that system. Okay. So that's the most commonly used test to evaluate anaerobic fitness. Now the reason why this test is sort of, we call it the gold standard, notice that in terms of the 30-second duration, if we're trying to evaluate the ability of glycolysis, a test that is 30 seconds long gets the highest anaerobic contribution. If we extend to 90 seconds, notice the aerobic energy system is contributing just as much as glycolysis, and we want to evaluate the capacity of this system with this specific test. That's why we tend to use the 30-second time duration on the wind gate, because it gets the largest contribution from glycolysis as opposed to other shorter or longer time durations. The baby's not drinking her bottle because she's too distracted by me talking. I guess she finds this subject pretty interesting. Okay, so let's go to our last system, the aerobic energy system. Now this is what we have measured the last 2 labs with VO2 max testing. VO2 max testing is going to be considered to be the best way to evaluate the capacity of the long-term or the aerobic energy system. Again, they use long-term in this chapter, but we're talking about the aerobic energy system. And what VO2 max is really telling us, what influences it? Think back to that Fick equation. Not only how fast can you deliver oxygen-rich blood, that's the cardiac output, this was the capacity of the heart, but then how fast can your muscles extract the oxygen from the blood and use it to produce ATP. So these factors that they list here really pertain to that AVO2 difference. The more capillaries you have that surround the muscle, the faster you're going to be able to get oxygen out of the blood into the muscle, which is good. The more mitochondria you have in the muscle means greater ability to produce ATP, okay? And then muscle fiber typing, not something we've talked about, but type 1 muscle fibers have more mitochondria than type 2. So if you have a higher percentage of type 1 muscle fibers, you're going to typically have a higher VO2 max, okay? And again, here we're showing kind of like the specificity. It just shows us the typical VO2 max values of different athletes in women and men. Cross-country skiers tend to have the highest VO2 max values, even above runners. And why would that be? Think back to that full body activity thing we talked about last chapter. With running, you're using your arms passively. So there's some muscle involvement, but maybe not maximal. With skiing, you're using your arms more actively, so there's going to be a greater oxygen requirement in those muscles, and that could boost VO2 max, right? Swimming comes in third for women. I'm not sure why it's not on the men's category here at all. But basically what we're starting with the most full body activity to the least full body activity, and that kind of goes in both of these. Typically athletes who are more full body oriented have higher VO2 max values than athletes that have more kind of lower body based activities. And then obviously sedentary subjects, they do not place the demand on their body to improve, so their VO2 max levels stay low. By stressing your body to improve, it will improve. So if you play or do one of these sports listed here, your VO2 max will improve. Right, Sadie? Right. Okay, so for tests, now again, in the last 2 labs, we've done direct measurement of VO2 max. That is going to be the best way to assess VO2 max, okay? But it's not always practical because of a few reasons we'll look at on the next slide. So we have an alternative, and these are what are known as submaximal or aerobic capacity prediction tests. Now you might remember we talked about the fact that when we predict things, we're going to introduce error, okay, which is not great. However, in some cases, we might need to use these types of tests because true maximal testing is not always practical, right? You all saw on the last 2 labs how hard true VO2 max testing is. You're not going to do that with a sedentary person or with somebody who is obese or with somebody who has heart disease, right? You're going to want to choose a safer option, a more appropriate option for somebody at that skill level. A submax test is going to be a better option in that case, okay? So rather than directly measuring VO2 max using gas analysis, we're going to predict what their VO2 max is based upon their heart rate response to submaximal exercise. Remember, submaximal means less than maximal. So it's going to be a less intense test. And we're going to measure their response to that less intense activity and then predict what their VO2 max is. By doing that, we are going to introduce error, and we call that error the standard error of estimate, and we abbreviate that as the C, the SEE, okay? So there's a few assumptions that we're going to look at on another slide, but they kind of introduce a couple here. I pulled some information from a different PowerPoint that I like better. But there are assumptions that are made with submaximal testing, and as we'll see in a second, those assumptions are not safe because they're really not true, and that's what's going to lead to this error that we see. So I like the number 5 to 10 better than 8 to 10, but the idea is with these submaximal tests, there's going to be a plus or minus 5 to 10% error in the value that we measure. So let's just say that we measure somebody, or we predict somebody's VO2 max to be 50 using one of these tests. We would put the plus or minus 5 to 10% on that. So we would say 50 ml per kg per minute plus or minus 5 to 10%. So 10% of 50 would be 5, right? So that means their VO2 max could be 45, could be 55, because it's 50 plus or minus 5 to 10%. Now again, we use heart rate to determine what the VO2 max is. Okay, so imagine this graph kind of shows it. So say that we're going to have a couple exercise stages, and we're going to measure the heart rate during that stage. Okay, and we get us a couple data points here. So what we would do is we would stop the test at an appropriate heart rate. Okay, let's say we stop it at 170. What we would then do is what we call extrapolate. So we would imagine if we continued up to their max heart rate, what would their VO2 be, right? We see what the VO2 would be at a measured heart rate of 170. It would be here. So what we're going to do is imagine if we continue to their max heart rate, which they should be at their VO2 max at their max heart rate, what would that VO2 max be? All right, let's put the baby back in her crib and we'll continue. You all have your challenges doing school at home. I have my challenges working at home, and one of those challenges is having to take care of a baby in the middle of doing a lecture. But hey, we do what we got to do. So again, the take-home point with this slide and this graph is, this gives us a visual example of what we're doing here. We're going to gather a couple heart rates during the test at a submaximal level, and then we're going to predict if we went to the max heart rate, what would the VO2 be at that point, right? And that's what these dotted lines represent. If we went here in the untrained or the trained person, where would their VO2 max be, right? So we're predicting what it would be if we went to their max heart rate. And another thing that we'll do with submax testing, and you'll see this in the step test that we're going to do in the lab, is we might measure their recovery heart rate, right? So the faster your heart rate drops down after exercise, the more fit you are, okay? And that's what this is showing us here, is that a more rapid recovery heart rate is associated with higher levels of oxygen consumption. So there's a step test that we're going to do in the lab where we're not going to measure the heart rate during the test. What we're going to do is have the person complete 3 minutes of stepping, and then as soon as the test is over, we're going to have him sit down, and we'll measure his heart rate during that 1 minute post-test, and we'll use that heart rate we get after 60 seconds to predict what his VO2 max would be. Now, this kind of takes us to how would we make the choice? Do we want to do a max test or do we want to do a submax test? There's a lot of factors to consider, right? What's the reason for testing? If you have an athlete who needs to know what his or her VO2 max is, and they're used to pushing themselves at a max level of exertion, you might choose the true max test, okay? With an athlete, the risk level is low because they're used to pushing themselves at a high level over and over again through training. With the sedentary person, there's a higher risk because they're not used to pushing themselves to their max capacity, so you might choose the submax test. The equipment, right? Most gyms, no gyms really, are going to have that $30,000 machine that we have in our lab. So in most commercial settings, you're going to have to use submax testing. Submax testing only requires a treadmill and a heart rate monitor max. You can even get away with less than that. Usually submax tests are shorter in duration, which could be good if you're strapped for time. They usually cost a lot less as well. Submax tests, because they're less than maximal, and there's less risk, you don't typically require like a physician to be present. With a max test, you may need that, right? Because there's more risk involved. With the sedentary population, that error that we talked about is okay, right? So the accuracy is not as important with the general population. But if you're doing research or if you're testing pro athletes, you want more accurate data. So in that case, you might go with the True VO2 max test. Okay. So these are the factors you would consider when picking max or submax. Like I said, in gym settings, if you work as a personal trainer, you're only going to do submax testing. You would only do max testing if you're working in a lab-based setting for the most part. Now, these assumptions I talked about earlier, this is the slide I like to look at. There's 5 things that we assume happen, but as we'll see here, they don't happen. And the fact that they don't happen leads to this error that I mentioned earlier, plus or minus 5 to 10% ml per kg per minute. We assume that heart rate and work rate have a linear relationship throughout the whole span of the heart rate. Not true. It does within this range, but outside of this range, the relationship is not linear, okay? So the fact that we assume it's linear and it's not leads to some error, okay? We assume steady state heart rate is achieved at each work rate. Now we can control for that, and we'll try to during the test that we're going to do in lab. So that one is not as important. Number 3, we assume that this formula 220 minus age is an accurate way to predict max heart rate. The truth is there's a pretty big error, plus or minus 11 beats per minute across the whole population. So again, that is going to contribute some to this error. Number 4, we assume mechanical efficiency is the same for all people. That is not the case, right? If you have an experienced runner and a novice runner, the experienced runner is going to be more efficient, so they're going to have a lower heart rate at a given speed, okay? So again, that is a big one that contributes to some of this error, okay? And then lastly, this is one we need to account for as well, is there are a lot of medications that can affect heart rate. Again, submax testing relies on heart rate response to exercise. If somebody is taking a drug that affects their heart rate response, that's going to have a negative impact on the test results, and that's going to sort of invalidate them, right? Beta blocker is a common blood pressure medication that keeps people's heart rate low to help control blood pressure. Well, in a submax test, a low heart rate would be interpreted as a very high level of fitness, when in reality, it could be their medication keeping the heart rate low, not the fact that they're fit. So that's another thing to consider. If you're doing a submax test on a person in the future, you want to be aware of what medications they're on if those medications affect heart rate, okay? And again, these things for the most part are not necessarily true. So they account for this significant error that we see associated with submax testing. But I'll say in a lot of instances, it's worth the trade-off of keeping the client safe, acknowledging that there is this error that's present, but keeping the client safe is more important than the error that exists. Okay, so finishing up here. These are the 3 testing protocols, submax testing protocols I'm going to have you watch for lab 4, okay? Record some data. We have a treadmill test, which is a walking-based test. This is a really good test because, as we've talked about, walking is a familiar form of exercise to most people, so this is a really good test to use, okay? All you really need to do is measure heart rate during the test, and if you put a heart rate monitor on a person, sorry about that, that makes it pretty easy to do. We have a step test, which is not as accurate. But the good news about the step test is it only takes 3 minutes. And if you have access to a lot of aerobic steps, or you can even use bleachers in a gymnasium, you can test a lot of people at one time, right? Which is good if you have like a group, like a sports team you're trying to test, or a group of senior citizens, whatever. The only thing about this one is it can be harder because you have to step up and down for 3 straight minutes. So that might not be good for senior citizens. Or if people have balance issues, hip injuries, this could be a test you wouldn't want to do, okay? And then our third option is a bike test. The YMCA cycloergometer test is the most common, the most popular. It's kind of complicated, as you'll see in the lab. So just try to follow along and record the data, and we go over it again at the end of the lab assignment. So this is a good test if you have an overweight person because it's a non-weight bearing activity, right? If you have somebody that has an injury that's aggravated with weight bearing activity, like a hip injury, knee injury, ankle injury, etc., the treadmill might not be good for them, but a bike test would be less aggravating to the injury. Okay. Also, it's been found that subjects are typically less anxious on a bike than a treadmill, especially if they're sedentary or novices, because they're seated and they're not worried about falling off the treadmill, which if people haven't been on a treadmill before, they can be a little nervous about falling off of it, taking a bad step. So they're more anxious. Anxiety can impact heart rate because it elevates it. So having the person be relaxed is going to actually increase the accuracy of your test. Okay. The bad news is if somebody is not a cyclist, this test gets very hard, and the local muscle fatigue in the legs can actually cause them to stop versus their cardiovascular system. So what I have for you are these tasks. Again, there are 3 separate lab videos. The lab assignment has space to record the data for each of the 3 videos. So you might want to just have the lab assignment open or have a piece of notebook paper ready to jot down the data. I do want to say when you turn the lab assignments in, make sure you don't just turn in like the answer. I want to see the data. So record the data, because that's kind of the point of these labs is that's what you would be doing in a classroom. You would be recording the data. So, and I would ask you to turn that in. So make sure for your electronic submissions, figure out a way to turn the data in. I don't really love it when you take a picture of a piece of notebook paper, but if that's what you have to do to submit it, go for it, okay? So, lecture study questions, watch the lab videos, complete the lab assignment. There are no critical thinking questions again this week because we have the lab. So that's it for today. Hope you all enjoyed this lecture and lab, and I'll come back and talk to you soon. Take care.